Moving on now from prior probability, how do the evidential chips from experience fall for theism? That brings me to my next argument, and my most important one, the argument from imperfection. The imperfections we observe are evidence against theism because the probability of observing them given perfect being theism is 0. We can only confer this probability on this observation if we make assumptions about perfect being theism, and perfection more broadly. Those assumptions are given by my premise G. A perfect creator could not create anything less than a perfect universe. If it's conceded that H, the universe, contains imperfection, then conclusion I follows. There is no perfect creator of the universe. We might be tempted to deny G, but that premise is entailed by God's omnipotence and moral perfection. The actions of a perfect being cannot decrease the degree of perfection of the universe as a whole in any possible world. And that claim entails premise G. Premise G, then, is necessarily true.
Do you think? Oh.
Okay. Yeah, so I was just explaining because he kind of generally goes over and
then maybe. How about let's continue until he gets the I, and then we'll stop because there's a lot we could say on this.
Okay.
Premise H is the only contingent premise we can deny. Why think the universe contains imperfections such that the universe is worse than it would be? What sort of observation probabilistically counts as evidence against theism? It is to these questions that I now turn.
So do you want to say anything before he gets into those specific examples?
So there's a lot of, I don't want to get too much into details here because I'm gonna talk a lot about the problem of evil when we get to his argument there, but there are some general.
I think we lost Kyle for a second.
Oh shoot!
An argument.
Oh, he's back.
Because
hey, Kyle, can you sorry, we lost you for like 5 seconds.
Oh, hello.
Mm-hmm.
Just restart. Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, so what I was gonna say is that there are some I guess general considerations we want to take into account when it comes to this argument, right? So the way that Ben is proceeding, right, is he's taking the theoretical concept of theism, which is that God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all good, right? Or maybe in this case, he's saying that God is perfect, right? And so then therefore, given that content, we say, okay, God can only create a perfect universe, right? But the problem, at least the first initial worry I have there, and this will become relevant more in the problem of evil, but is that Ben is using an axiology that is controversial, I would say, right? So basically what he's doing here is he's using a certain axiology in order to say, well, given this axiology and given theism, then we would expect a perfect universe, but since we don't see that, then that would be disconfirmation, right?
Can I just say something real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
So if you notice what Ben is saying, I'll say this real quick and I'll hand it just back to you, Ben. What you notice what Ben is saying is he said, and the imperfections of the universe are evidence against perfect being theism. And then he gives this logical argument. Perfect creator would not create anything less than a perfect universe. The universe is imperfect. Therefore, there is no perfect creator of the universe. If you notice what he said before he presented this argument, he said that G is an assumption. So to make this argument work, he's proceeding with this assumption. The assumption is that a perfect creator would not create anything less than a perfect universe. And that assumption is fundamental and is indispensable for him to make his argument. He needs that assumption to make the argument. So what I'm trying to say is, well, it's an assumption. It can be questioned. It can be doubted. Now he goes to defend the assumption, but it's an assumption that just isn't taken for granted. It's not a given, like how I was saying. This is a controversial premise. And so if you have different assumptions, if the interlocutor has a different assumption, then this is going to be very problematic for the argument logically here. So I just want to say that Ben fully explicitly states that G is the assumption that he has to use, the starting assumption he has to use to make the argument.
Yeah, that's good. I would just say it's tricky to make like deductive arguments in general, because it's just always gonna be a way for like a premise that someone can deny. And it's something I talked about with like Jonah when we had our conversation on the problem of evil recently. So that's one of the things like I think you guys hinted at a little bit that's really important to remember is like when you're making like these kind of deductive arguments, it's really relying on Ben's intuitions and can he defend them. And these kind of arguments can be very tricky to defend. So yeah.
And what's interesting, and Marilyn Adams points this out. I mean, we could say that this argument from imperfection is a logical argument from evil, given that that it relies on evils to be supported. But that when you're making these arguments, there really isn't any religion neutral starting point to make with these. Like Kyle was saying, like it's like there is axiology being involved here, being and not being shared between the two parties that are arguing about this particular premise here, and everything. So he thinks that, well, it seems like a lot of the times we feel as though, or at least naturalists kind of think that they can start with these religion neutral assumptions about axiology, but there actually aren't any. You actually can't do that to make this argument. So anyways, Kyle, go ahead.
No, yeah, and I mean, I know Tim, you had a lot. I know there's a paper about Satan's apple you wanted to discuss. I'll talk more about the axiology when I go with the probable, but that's the first thing I want to point out is that in order for Ben to use this argument, there's gonna have to be he has to use the content of theism to do that, but then he also has to use his axiology, which will be controversial, right? So that's just the main thing I want to point out. And then I know Tim, you had a lot to say on the imperfection part specifically.
Yeah. So I'm just gonna point out just points, just kind of some defeaters that someone can present to this kind of argument. And none of these points I'm going to say should be rationally compelling, but they can be presented as taking the scene as defeaters. So the idea here is, so in that paper, I forget the philosopher's
When God
name.
meets Adam's apple. I think
Who's
that's
it
what
by?
it was called. I forgot. I think it was Rubio or something.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
But basically, it's a paper about worlds, and it's called The Paradox of Creation. And basically, the idea is that the author points out is that if we have this idea that God should create, God, since he's a perfect creator, he has this obligation to create a perfect world, or a best possible world, or the best possible world. I know there's a different, Ben brings up, there's a difference between a best and the best, right? But either way, you're going to run into a paradox that God can't really create any world at all, because the upper and lower threshold is that there's this kind of assumption that God will make no inferior choice. That if you have a choice between A and B, and A is inferior to B, then if these are worlds, then God's going to create world B. But then there's going to be a world that B is inferior to, and there's going to be a world that C is inferior to, and D is inferior to, and ad infinitum, you can never stop going down that series. And then it turns out that God actually can't create anything at all, because every choice will be inferior, because you can always do something better. There can always be added more value. There can be less defects, in that world, right? So it's called the paradox of creation, right? And so it's a very complex and sophisticated paper. I'll just let you guys know it's very technical. But basically the author, and I sent this paper to Ben too, so maybe he's read it and stuff. If he sees this, then he'll know about it. But I think he'll agree with me that it was quite technical. But basically the philosopher basically argues that there's really only two ways that you can really escape this problem. Either you can go a Swinburnian route, but of course the classical theist isn't going to go the Swinburnian route. So he says if you're a classical theist, then you should go Marilyn Adams route, which is that we can't apply any obligations to gods, basically, is the idea. That God actually, the way out is that God actually doesn't have any obligation to create a best or the best or perfect world, right? And then Rob Coons has a paper called what does God aim at maximizing? And it's a paper about world creation as well. And basically Coons brings up this problem that's notable in the literature called it's a notion of incommensurability. When something's incommensurate, it's something that it's something that cannot be measured against something else. It's disproportionate to something else, right? You could take two shapes of unequal of unequal lengths, and they're incommensurate to one another. That kind of idea. It's kind of a mathematical idea. And the idea here is that you will run into this issue of incommensurability, right? When you're creating worlds, right? So if you want to say that there is a best or the best or a perfect world, then you're going to run into this issue of commensurability because incommensurability, because these worlds will end up being incommensurate to one another, right? I mean, best in relation to, well, Ben wants to say it's relative to a perfect world, which would be some kind of idealized instance of a world, right? But that's, I mean, that's very hard to figure out because there are, and he's aware of this whole idea in philosophy called the repugnant conclusion, I think. But there's this idea that, there could be certain worlds that have values that certain other worlds don't. But this world over here is valuable in its own way, incommensurate to this other world over here, right? So for example, Helen Keller is, no one would deny that who she is and what she was able to do wasn't valuable. It was amazingly valuable, right? Her disabilities contributed to who she was as a person, her identity, and what she was able to do, and the valuable things. But that doesn't say that disability is more valuable than being able, right? They're incommensurate with one another. Just like someone who was able to make it to the Olympics, or someone who was able to make it to world-class swimming championships, right? A swimmer, but they had the natural disposition to do it. They were naturally good at it. Is any better than someone who worked really hard for it? They're valuable in their own way. They're incommensurate to one another, right? It's the same way with worlds. And so Kuhn's concludes that given incommensurability, and he brings up overlapping points in the paper Paradox of Creation as well, of the no inferior choice principle and all the different things that the best thing that we can say is that what does God aim at maximizing? Well, God aims at maximizing, he thinks, nothing. That God is just simply interested in creating good things. He just wants to bring about good things and let good things flourish. And that's all we can really say that God should be able to do, right? So this whole idea in premise G, a perfect creator would not create anything less than a perfect universe, has some assumptions, axiological assumptions that are not religion neutral, about what God being perfect is obligated to do. Given Kuhn's and given the writer of the paper Paradox of Creation, they would disagree here. And Kuhn's actually brings up, it's interesting, this is something Marilyn Adams says too, which is that oftentimes to make these arguments, the naturalist actually has to define the theist's value theory for them. What that basically means is that to show that that this really isn't the kind of world that God would create, they have to define the value theory that the theist is using in terms of their own value theory to make the argument. And so Kuhn's points out that, religious believers, especially in Western monotheism, and especially what is depicted in the scriptures, if you in the Bible, is the kind of ethic and the kind of value system that they're operating on is very agent-centered and deontic, right? So they would have very much different conclusions about, what God is obligated to do in terms of world creation. So those are my beginning points. But basically, in terms of what Ben says, he actually says later on, but you don't have to play it now, but he actually says later on in the opening that a world is perfect if its wrong-making properties are sufficiently counterbalanced by its right-making properties, both known and unknown. And then he goes into providing justification for that through evils, right? And I'll let Kyle do the evils part. But basically, there is there's a kind of issue and a nuance that we need to point out here between balancing off and defeat, right? So Ben views worlds as organic unities. And organic unities would be seen in terms of value parts instead of value wholes. And Kuhn's the writer of Paradox of Creation and Adams all agree that we shouldn't view worlds when it comes to theism as being our organic unities. And so the balancing off relation is an arithmetical an additive. It's that value parts are balanced off within a larger whole to which they bear. And so in these cases, the whole could have a different value from the parts. And so Ben is using more of a balancing off relation notion than what Roderick Chisholm has coined in terms of the concept called defeat.
Okay.
And
we'll get to defeat in the
but-
probable stuff.
right, but
anyway,
this is important because Ben uses the balancing off relation to make his argument that this world is imperfect.
right.
And he doesn't use a different notion such as defeat to show that the world is actually imperfect or perfect, right? So if the value parts were networked to the whole possible world through additive relations, then it would be impossible for a world that contains evil to be considered perfect or a best. But if you switch the conditions to defeat, right, then the conclusion becomes different. So that's going to introduce a lot of doubt into this kind of imperfection argument.